typically in art history classes, at least the ones that I took ages and ages and ages ago, while the history was still happening, uh, one thing that was really interesting to me is that there is this underlying assumption that drives how everything is categorized, that the peak of art is whatever white people are doing in the West right now. And I remember I was a special docent and consultant with the BYU Art Museum when they did an Islamic exhibit about 12 years ago. People at the BYU Art Museum had no idea that BYU had their own imam and prayer space for Muslims that were students. And it was, as we were I was talking about with the faculty about a follow-up show that BYU was going to do. And somebody actually asked the question, well, is there anything worthwhile really being done in the Arab world, art-wise? And I remember how surprised I was, because that demonstrated how thoroughly they had bought into this idea that the peak of art and the relevance of art was established and maintained by essentially European colonizers in the West. You know, Europe and the US drive the worldwide art market. Thankfully, things have changed since then. One of the things that Prince said was, as the cost of music production goes down, so does, for the most part, the value. But he said that the other thing that happens is, as the entry bar lowers, then more people that have something to say also get a chance. And I guess what I'm saying with all that is, with all the technology and the close connection we have around the world, I think that even people that don't spend a lot of time thinking about art recognize that there are voices that are active absolutely everywhere on the planet. Every continent has its own artistic traditions, and that even includes Antarctica. Extra credit, gold star for anybody who can name the medium and the tradition that is attached to Antarctica. And it doesn't have anything to do with Admiral Byrd's flyover of the South Pole when he witnessed dinosaurs in a hole in the ice. Have you guys ever came across that? You ever read that? Journal. It's the Journal of Admiral Byrd. And right at the tail end of World War II, Admiral Byrd was sent down with a big flotilla of ships to Antarctica, ostensibly to scout it to see if it was viable for a U.S. base. And they basically had their butts handed to them and came back. Several planes were lost, several ships were lost, several lives were lost. And what officially happened is that the weather was really bad, which I think is completely believable. But after Admiral Byrd died, this journal he supposedly wrote surfaced, where he actually talked about the Spiel, or the Bell craft that the Nazis had built in their base called New Schwabenland in Antarctica, and that those craft had attacked the U.S. fleet. And he also, in his journal, also talks about when he flew over the South Pole, seeing a giant hole in the ice and seeing dinosaurs and plants. So what's interesting to me about all that is that there's an author named A.E. Merritt who wrote in the 20s and 30s fantasy novels right along those lines. So I'm sure there's absolutely no coincidence that this oddly appearing journal with absolutely no provenance that it can be trusted happens to mirror so much of what A.E. Merritt wrote. I'm sure that's complete coincidence. Anyway, talking about weird and wild things, today this week we're going to be looking at just a little bit of the art that we see in parts of Africa. where else have we also talked about art in Africa?
Egypt.
Yeah. And it's interesting because that is a cognitive bypass that we're all trained to have from early on. Somehow there's this communication that Egypt really isn't part of Africa. It's somehow, it's more closely allied to the Etruscans, the Greeks, and the Romans as it is to the continent of Africa, which I think is astounding. And I don't know if you guys remember the hubbub a while back where, oh, I can't remember her name. She underwrote a project about Cleopatra where they actually had a lot of Black African actors portraying Cleopatra and a lot of the important roles. And she got a lot of backlash from Dr. Awasi of the Egyptian Antiquities Department and several Egyptian scholars from Egypt. And I remember one of the clips was where they said that they thought it was really offensive that she was trying to blackwash history. There's no irony there whatsoever. The reality is that there were several different groups of people that controlled and governed Egypt at different periods of time. And you can look at the artwork to kind of see where those groups have come from. Nubians were incredible engineers, and there were some Semites that were there, as well as some other groups as well. Anyway, we've also talked a little bit about Zimbabwe, talking about Cyclopean architecture when we were dealing with Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Zimbabwe is an inland country that has some incredibly fantastic architecture that is more closely allied with the kind of sideways thinking, at least from our perspective, that you see in the ancient ruins in Turkey than in other areas of a similar time period in Africa, which I think is absolutely fascinating. I remember when I was a kid, which was, shortly after the TV was invented. Thank you, Joey. I appreciate your laughter. But
Hey,
one
TV.
thing, what's
Sorry,
that?
TV was invented by a guy from Beaver, Utah.
Yeah, and his niece, his grandniece, is a photography graduate here at Utah Tech, Sabra. Yeah, very, very, very cool. When I was young, it was during the 80s, somebody was talking about they were having some diplomats from Nigeria that were coming, and then somebody trying to be helpful said, "Oh, let's have the flag of Africa on the car." What's the problem with that?
There's not really a flag of Africa as a continent.
No, the flag of Africa is about as definitive as the flag of the United Nations. I mean, how is that going to help? There's, depending on the count, whether you include different islands, there's 54 to 56 different countries in Africa. And one of the world's most astounding conquerors actually lived and died only 700 years ago, named Sundiata. And he liberated a path, and I say liberated because, like Alexander the Great, he was not the typical conqueror. He didn't kill everybody. He went through and he established publicly funded education so everybody could learn to read and write, and made sure the constitutions were developed that protected freedoms of religious expression. So, when we think about Africa, there's a lot of stuff that we have programmed into our heads. And from TV and things like that, I mean, all of us that have stayed up late at night have seen those ads showing the skinny kids crying because they're starving to death. And that's all we see from Africa. Nobody's seeing the incredible marble homes that would be like $5 million homes here in the US that are going for 140,000 in Nigeria. I mean, just absolutely gorgeous stuff. Some of the cleanest cities in the world, and real Wakanda, fantasy type stuff going on. And I don't know if you guys know this, but over 14,000 different languages have their roots having been invented in Africa over the last several thousand years. Human Genome Program, or mapping program, linked the oldest mitochondrial DNA, which goes down through the mother's lines, links back to an Eve who had her origin in Central Africa. That's where all humanity comes from. There's more human genetic diversity within any 3,000-mile circle that you can paint on the continent than there is in any other two continents on the planet. I mean, it is astonishing. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on. And of course, we're going to cram all that into a week. But what we are looking at is, we're not going to be looking at the whole continent, because we could have, there are people that get their degrees, their PhDs, just studying how to catalog the different kinds of artifact production that have happened, in Africa. The oldest tools that have been cataloged so far are in China, about 2 million years old, but the oldest architecture that has been cataloged is in South Africa, and that's about 1.8 million years old. It's called Adam's Clock or Adam's Garden. And people who do not have a vested interest in it being a real thing claim that it's just naturally occurring, which is interesting because it's very rare that you see consistent tool marks in a naturally occurring rock. But that's just me. So what we're talking about is this little teeny area. And that's it. Look at all this stuff that's going on. Egypt is up here. We have Libya. I think that's Morocco, maybe. South Africa, of course. Zimbabwe is over here. And just a lot of really amazing stuff. And of course, the Ark of the Covenant, Indiana Jones found that right about where my finger's pointing right there. Lots of cool stuff through here. And we're just going to be talking about this area. The guy named Sundiata that I mentioned, he conquered an area of Africa about as big as this, which in landmass was greater than almost any other of the historical world conquerors that we know about. Just pretty amazing stuff. Now, I don't know if you guys have seen this image. Does anybody recognize this image? Okay, this is from the Ifa.
It does look familiar.
Yeah, this is a bronze head from the Ifa Kingdom. If I remember the story right, and if it wasn't for this, it was one that was done by the same group of people, probably within a century or so of it. But if I remember right after World War I, a Nigerian prince was extending his palace, and this is before the days of Nigerian princes emailing everybody for money, but was extending his palace, and the workmen uncovered this head in the dirt. And so a visitor from Europe bought it for like $15 or something, absolutely ridiculous. And he took it went home with him to the UK, went over to the British Museum and sold it to them for like $35. And they determined that it was only a couple hundred years old, maybe 350 years old. Anybody want to guess how old it actually is? And look at this thing. We can see it's done pretty photorealistically. It is, if you saw this person on the street with their scarification lines, you'd be able to recognize them.
I guess at least more than 600, maybe 700.
Well, it kept getting dated back further and further. This thing is about 2,000 years old. And what's fascinating is I was looking on the internet, the articles, the age would vary with who the person had talked to about the article. When the British Museum first got a hold of this, they thought it was a couple hundred years old, because that kind of fit in with the narrative of the colonializing process that they were undergoing. And within 20 years, they realized that it was at least 600 years old. And then just about every 20 to 30 years after that, people have pushed it back even older and older. But for a long time, there was a great deal of resistance about this being older than 600 years old, because that would mean that these guys knew how to do photorealistic bronze casting before the Renaissance. And that, of course, that could not fit with the colonized, the perspective of the colonizing groups. And I just think it's astounding to me how much of Yoruba history, and this is the area that we're talking about. We go, if I show you this map again, this area that we're talking about, the Yoruba people, that's one of the names for the people. It's also called Ife. The Ife kingdoms are after the line of the Ife families, and Yoruba is the name of the ancient name of the area. So it's the Yoruba peoples. But they are, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse. We're talking about an area where these people culturally impacted folks all around here. So yeah, this is about the size of France itself, but the Yoruba people impacted and traded and influenced the languages, customs, and art of people around them, probably about the size, almost the size of Europe. I mean, it was a pretty good spread. They had a lot of influence. And these, I would like you to go through and watch each of these are about 3 to 5 minutes long. And there's a couple things that I want you to get as you go through these things, and a couple things that I'm going to talk about just really, really quickly. These articles are very important. They talk about the Orishes and ancient Yoruba. Now, why is this important, and why is this area important? Historically, what does this area say to you? And we're talking about right towards the tail end of the Age of Discovery, moving into the Age of the Enlightenment. Why is that area of the world so important?
It's about the center, almost the center of Africa.
Well, it's the center of the slave trade.
Oh.
The Black African slave trade, there were actually two primary markets. And I don't know, it's hard for me to talk about this because it makes me want to throw up. My youngest daughter comes from Zimbabwe, and this just is nauseating to me. But the two major markets of human beings from the continent of Africa were areas back here, the Muslim governments back here, and the Christian governments that colonized this area, the North and South America. And I've read articles where it talked about a few different numbers, but it's pretty consistent to between about 80 to 85% of all of the humans that were sold over here traveled through this area. And so that's one of the reasons why I selected this to kind of introduce you to some of the art from the continent, because as people are retracing their family histories and reclaiming their identities, they're finding that a lot of their ancestors came through this area. So it's very heavily influenced. And I'll just mention a couple things. Yoruba, the Yoruba cultures really heavily influenced religious, specifically African religious experience in the Americas. Further south you go, the more Catholic influence would cause this crossover to kind of morph into what we would recognize as voodoo and Santeria. And the more north you go, that Yoruba influence was diluted through a lot of Protestant perspective, and it became hoodoo, which isn't really a religion, but it ties in pretty well. So when we talk about orishas, the word orisha is very similar to like pantheon, for example. When I say pantheon, what's the group of people that you think of first?
The Greeks. Greek.
Yeah, it's essentially Greek gods, and this is where we get Joseph Campbell talking about the principal personifications of natural elements into godly type or deified forms. So we have Greek and Roman gods, we have Norse gods. Those are from further north, and the orishas were the same thing further south. And there's an incredible amount of parallels to. So I think Joseph Campbell was really onto something. There's a lot of parallels with the Orisha traditions and the 411 Orishas that are celebrated with the Greek and Roman gods, and further north you go, Celts and stuff like that. So, again, those things are really interesting to know, because when people make artifacts with the intention of lasting, they are including imagery that is important to them. And more often than not, that imagery that is important to them reflects how they interface with the universe. And this is where we start getting into religion and mythology. Remember, mythology is not fantasy. What is mythology?
Stories that explain how the world is the way it is.
Yeah, it is the truth that's behind truth. So it is what you use to help you navigate everything else, and so there's no fantasy to it. So I go through here and look at the technology and stuff like that, but these guys, they have a pretty consistent culture that bleeds through about 10,000 years of history. And about 2,000 years ago, they really started working with bronzes. And you can see a lot of evidence of this very naturalistic, realistic looking bronzes. One thing that I think is interesting, though, is look at this figure right here. What do you notice about this figure?
A little stubby.
Yeah, a head height is usually what, 1/7, 1/8 of a person's overall proportions, typically. And here it's about 1/4, 1/5. Now, if you look at the hands and the feet, I mean, these feet are as naturalistic as any of the Polyclitus sculptures. The hands are tremendously naturalistic, and these faces are astounding. So why would they, if they knew how to do those things, which are historically the hardest for an artist to render life in a lifelike way, why would they screw up on the body?
Deliberately? Like it's a stylistic?
Yeah, it's definitely a stylistic choice. They did it on purpose. And a lot of people believe now that it's that stylistic choice reflects what was most important to them. You know, like we look at why are the eyes so big for the Byzantines, the Etruscans, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, because some, you know, they felt that there was a lot of importance in the eye. And in Yoruba tradition, everything that matters about you being a human being is in your head. You know, this is the most important thing. And that's where your soul resides. Most Western culture, your soul resides in your chest because that's where you feel the pulses of the vagus nerve complex. The vagus nerve connects emotional centers of your brain throughout your whole body. And that's why you feel empathy in your heart and everything. And for Yoruba people, historically, that the connection, rather than being in your heart, was in your head. And we're going to be talking about several different kinds of kingdoms, Ife, Nok, and others. And the words are basically just different groups of people within this geographical region. And before I go much further, I wanted to talk a little, and there's a lot of stuff to get through, so I just want to introduce it to you a little bit, and I want you to watch at least 3 or 4 of each of the videos, if not all of them, and look and glance over all the articles so you can kind of get a feel for what this is. And if it inspires you to do more research on your own, that's even better. In the classes that I teach, there's been a little bit of confusion on weekly reflections, and I wanted to sidestep and talk about this really, really quickly. The weekly reflection is your reflection on material that we covered in the class and bound by the parameters of the class. What's the time parameters of this class?
Anywhere from prehistoric to Gothic?
To 1350, that's right. So if you are doing a weekly reflection on Chinese calligraphy, for example, and you're only referencing people that are born in the last 20 years, that's not going to count for this class. If you want to do a weekly reflection on Chinese calligraphy, you need to have your roots in the calligraphy that is done within the parameters of this class. If you want to tie that into contemporary stuff, and several of you have, that is absolutely just, you know, totally fine. And there's been a couple of people, like when we did Buddhism stuff a while ago in classical India, there were a couple of people that showed an image of classical Indian work and then of contemporary Indian work and compared the two. And that's totally fine because they rooted it in the parameters of this class. But if you just show, you know, pictures of bazaar that you went to when you visited Bangladesh, it's not going to work because why?
It's too recent for this course?
It's too recent and it's not grounded or rooted in the parameters of this course. So I hope that makes sense. And that's true for the discovery and research projects and everything else. And usually, if you see that I'm not giving you a grade or I make a note of that, ask me what you can do to fiddle with it. And there's been a couple instances where people have said, hey, I wanted to work on this, and you're saying it's not consistent with the parameters of the class. How do I get it consistent? And then we'll talk through that. And they were able to make a couple changes, and hey, presto, magic occurred, and everything fit. So it's a lot of it is how you frame it, and we've got to do that for this class. Okay, the next group of people. So we talked about Yoruba. They're the umbrella culture, and this will make sense. You know, as we talk about other groups around the world, we may talk about China. Does anybody know how many ethnic groups there are in China? There are at least 45 different distinct ethnic groups in China that have their roots in ancient China. but when we talk about the umbrella culture of China, we're talking about pretty much the stuff that's established with the dynasties and everything like that. And when I'm talking about Yoruba art, what I'm talking about is essentially the area in Nigeria and area around that, just like we would talk about Chinese art. And now when I talk about Ife, Nok, and others, we're talking about the specific groups within that umbrella. Does that make sense to everybody? Or are you totally lost? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay. And I've tried to give like spreads, and this is as of the morning that I wrote this, and things change as individuals around the world throw off the cultural anemia that accompanies colonialism. Then these dates fluctuate, and in some cases they fluctuate quite a bit. But it's a workable range. This is a really interesting video that talks about the history of Nigeria. What's fascinating to me about these different cultures that we're looking at is anciently the tradition is that there was a king who had several sons. Each of the sons started their own group, and that's what gave essentially each of these cultures that name. So more or less they're kind of parallel, but they do have their own distinct flavors to them. And as we look through this, there are some very significant 20th century artists that drew heavily from this work. Does any one come to mind right away?
Isn't this sorry, is this where Pablo Picasso started to reference Cubism?
Yeah. When he first, Cubism was his kind of expression of ideas about reality and perspectives, valued perspectives and time. This is when everybody had access to Edward Maybridge's photography through time, and cinematography was starting to be a thing. And in all that, Pablo Picasso would go on his walks every morning trying to figure out how he could pay the rent and end up at the ethnography museum. And some of these masks, there was actually a curator about 4 years ago who collected the masks that can be identified in a lot of those paintings by Picasso and put a display together showing the painting next to the mask that inspired him. So, and that is pretty cool. But yeah, it's a completely different way of looking at things. There is there's some elements that are parallel in appearance to like really ancient Celtic work, which I think is really fascinating, and other work from around the world. Like, for example, you see the large eyes. Like here we see very large eyes, which again seems to be indicative of a belief that eyes are important, and very stylized features. These are stylized specifically in this way for the Nok culture, which is about 700 covered about a 700-year span. They were iron workers, and a lot of the stuff that survives is the clay that they did. So this article talks quite a bit about them, and there's a really interesting image of some artwork that I think is pretty well gives you a good idea of what the Nok culture would produce stylistically. We have little critters here that a lot of people believe represent children, specifically since several of these figures are female. We have a couple indicators. I don't know if you can see. Okay, see this clean chin? See the jagged chin line, the clean chin line? And you see there's It looks like breasts right here, and a flat chest here. What does that tell you about the gender of these people? What gender do you think this person is supposed to represent?
The figure in the middle is male, and the figures on the left and right are meant to be female.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And it's interesting that, you know, these little figures, a lot of people believe that they represent children. And it's fascinating to me that they're using some stylistic devices with like relative size that was also used in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Europe in many places. I just think stuff like that is fascinating, which says to me that as human beings, a lot of the times we think along very similar ways. We want to demonstrate what's important with our art. We want to show that visually, and sometimes it's more important for us to communicate using symbolism than it is to make things look like what absolutely everybody else would make them look like. Okay, and another group of people is the Igbo-Ukwu. And this group of people, the influence it overlapped a bit, but this is a 200-year span that started about 300 years after the Nok people heyday. But this is still, oh, how can I say this? These dates are what the art, what people think the surviving artwork is. You know, that's about how old people believe the surviving artwork is. That's what the dates are. I'm sorry, my computer's futzing up a little bit. I'm going to fiddle with this for just a sec. Okay. And there's some really good short videos as well. You talk about the history. But this particular thing here, I believe that this is terracotta, but it reminds me of a lot of that really old bronze work that we saw from China. Does anybody else see any of that? And what's fascinating to me is that the Yoruba people were doing bronze work on the order of the kind of excellence that the Hans were doing in China, you know, thousands of miles away. They were doing a lot of really astounding things where the techniques seemed very similar to me. And I can't help but wonder, I wonder, did the people ever talk to each other, or is it just an example of parallel development? And I think that if we can see the same motif being used to the same scale in the same way for the same meaning in both cultures, then that would be evidence of communication. But I really wonder, because there is evidence that sailors from Egypt discovered Australia and started a trade relationship with people in Australia about 2,500 years ago. And there's evidence that Phoenicians had contact with somebody to get copper from the Great Lakes about 2,200 years ago. So, you know, a mere 1,000 years ago, it wouldn't surprise me if these guys were traipsing around and saw some of this stuff and brought it home. But I don't think we can say I don't think there's any evidence that I've had access to that could demonstrate that. I just think it's really intriguing, is what I'm saying. I think that's fascinating. This is a really good article that I want you guys to look at as well. And it talks about where these people were. Remember the area, if you can see my mouse, it's basically Nigeria, Benin, Togo, these countries right through here is what we're looking at. And this talks about how the people, this group was actually first recognized. It was completely accidentally. But some of this stuff I just think is absolutely astounding. This is, it's called leaded bronze, which is basically bronze that's decorated with lead. And what's fascinating to me about it is this is all metalwork. It's about 1,000 years old. What kinds of stuff does it make you think of? Think that this is not wire that's been tied. This has been cast. This metal has been cast in those shapes. And look at the decorations up here. This kind of reminds me a little bit of what the Harappans were doing, with that kind of stuff.
It kind of looks like a chain link fence.
Yeah, it's interesting. It looks like a net, doesn't it?
Yeah, I was about to mention it. It kind of reminds me of a fishing net.
Yeah, I just think it's really fascinating. But technologically, this is pretty consistent with the stuff that we see in the European Renaissance as well. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And this is, a good 400 years before Europeans were doing this kind of stuff. So maybe now I do know that Europeans were going around and looking at a lot of different stuff around the world, but it would be fascinating if any of you guys go into art history and write a paper talking about tracing what the actual influence this had on artwork from other places. That would be really fascinating. I don't know what influence it does have, but it would be really fascinating to find out.
Well, so I always get confused about, so obviously they're working with bronze. Bronze originates to Mesopotamia, right?
Well, I think it really depends on who you want to talk to. Bronze, one of the things that's fascinating to me is every culture that has a history of working with metals goes through the same phases as to which metals they discover first and process first. And bronze is a mix of copper and tin and some other stuff in there, where it becomes really amazing because it is a metal that can be molded and sharpened and then used extensively. Before, copper can be pounded into shape and sharpened, and then it goes dull really, really fast. And when you start working with iron and steel, that's when you can actually both mold it and hammer it into shapes, and it will keep a blade. That's why that's so amazing. And then bronze is seems to be the cultural evolutionary step in between the two. And it's interesting to me that it shows up in a lot of different places around the world, in different aspects, with some of the oldest bronze being coins cast with cuttlefish bones in Japan. Just with the Jumon culture, all the way to what we see here in ancient Nigeria and Mesopotamia and ancient China. There's some things in China that cast bronze bells that go back thousands of years. And then even before that, you get the dancing girls in India which I'm talking about sassy pants dancers,
So should we be thinking about this as people are just independently discovering bronze and then possibly sometimes sharing the information? Or is it like starting in a central place and then spreading? Or is it like people are just kind of also independently discovering? I guess that's a question.
It's interesting to me because there's a couple different models of thought about this, and James Peck would be a good person to talk to about what the most current ones are. For a long time, all of us were taught that the oceans were barriers, nobody crossed them. And then you find out the Smithsonian has flint stones that are carved with 2nd century Aramaic that were buried in the Virginia soil at least 800 years ago, so well before Columbus. And there's evidence that ancient Gallics went up the Oklahoma River at about the 2nd or 3rd century AD. And so, the Phoenicians left evidence of their journeys in Michigan. The Kennewick Man is the oldest intact skeleton in a human skeleton in North America, and he's Polynesian. And so I think, and it's also interesting that the ancient Chileans, at about the same time as the ancient Japanese, developed motifs in their pottery that were identical. So I think that there's, I think that what's actually happening is, as people are developing culture, they are trading with people around them. They are influenced by people around them. They are journeying around just like people do. But I think there might be more like whispers of ideas, people experimenting, brilliant people coming up with amazing things. And then as they gain more confidence as a culture, maybe that's when they start branching out and sharing ideas. So it's interesting to me that you can date bronzes back a really long time, but there's a lot more evidence to support the idea of parallel development. I think that seems to be more easily supported than something that demonstrates concretely the sharing of ideas until the groups become really wide ranging. And then you start seeing motifs, like as Egypt's trade routes expand in the spice trade and they start connecting with India and then China and then Japan. And then actually about during the reign of the Alexandrian pharaohs, it looks like they actually were trading with people that traded with the Americas, which is pretty cool. Because nicotine starts showing up in 2,000-year-old Alexandrian mummies, and nicotine only, until relatively recently, only existed in the Americas. So, which is kind of fascinating. But as cultures expand and flex their muscles, then I think maybe then the artists start talking to each other a lot more. But that seems to fit as much as what can be seen right now. But I'd be willing to bet that there is a secret organization or a secret cabal of multimillionaires that have all this stuff hidden away in a vault somewhere. And what we think we know is just the tip of the iceberg. Aubrey, I really hope that what I say is not going to be damaging the worldview of your children.
She was just showing me how to eat into your hand and not eat your hand. So
Well, okay, all right. So
okay.
don't have her repeat anything that we say in her social studies classes.
Yes, it's here.
Okay. Did that kind of back into addressing what you were talking about, Joey?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It's not any clearer though, but yeah.
I think it's more, there seems to be a greater preponderance of evidence demonstrating parallel development than there is that everybody got their knowledge from the same central source.
Yeah, cool. Got it.
That's the short answer, I think. Unless we want to throw in ideas about, Atlantis and all that kind of stuff, which that's fun to talk about it, but it really doesn't have a serious place yet in an art history class. Sorry. The next group of people I want to talk about a little bit are the Beninians. These are people that were masters of metalwork. They were really amazing, and I do want to watch something. Let's see. This is a really good video, and it's only okay. It is kind of long, so I think what I'm going to do is I'll leave the sound off, and we'll just go through it. But this person is a curator of a lot of these artifacts. And again, when you see the dates, there's a good chance that that may be where it came from, but it could also be older. It's the dates, I think, if you add a couple hundred years to a lot of the dates, that probably going to be a little bit more reflective of the cultural level that people were at. Just because, and I am going to make an editorial comment, colonizers have a tendency to disrespect the the respectable artifacts of the colonized, to the point where the kind of care that we give in any sort of anthropological dig now was completely ignored. So, and you can really see this during the Enlightenment. There was a demonstration of cranial capacity as a direct reflection of intelligence. And in the late 1700s, this is about 60 years after the birth of what we now deal with as racism. A person was saying he had decided on a racial hierarchy and was measuring cranial capacity and relative intelligence using mustard seed. So you pour mustard seed into the skull cavity and pour it out and then measure it, which he thought was incredibly scientific. What was fascinating is that, of course, the relative cranial capacity completely supported his assumption and assertion that white Europeans were the smartest because consistently their cranial capacity was greatest. What was interesting is that when he was forced to redo those experiments using all of the skulls from the collection instead of just a couple that he had picked, and using metal shot as opposed to something that can be squished down like mustard seed, what was the new results found that cranial capacity, the differences were statistically irrelevant. there was no real difference. And so so look at this stuff, take it for what it is. We'll use this as a reference, but just keep in mind that a lot of the stuff we see may be a lot older. This shows a lot of these bronze plaques. What is really very interesting to me is this is a completely different way of working with the metals that we've seen up until now. These seem to feel a lot more like embossed plaques. You do see this in the Mississippian culture, and we'll get to that in a couple of weeks and look at that stuff. See this in ancient Mycenaean Greek with precious metals. The ones that survive are gold. You see this with Semitic cultures, where they will do this with copper. They'll make copper embossed plates, and that's something that is a Semitic tradition from Jerusalem and the outlying areas that goes back thousands of years. But it's really interesting to me. And what's fascinating, I used to make stuff like this, but the copper plates I was working with were incredibly soft. There's no way that they would survive centuries of use and storage. So, looking at this, these two fish are right here. So the difference, this is about 6 inches across. If we look at that image, it's about 6 inches from here to here. So this face is less than a half an inch across. So, you look at that and you think, oh, well, these guys really didn't have a lot of control over their tools. People are scribing into a bronze plaque. So you're going to have to work with a metal that's harder than what you're doing. You're scratching in. It's very difficult. You've burnished all this down to give it the form and everything. It is a very labor-intensive process. And this face is only 3/8 of an inch across. So keeping that in mind, what impresses you about the skill level of whoever's doing this? What kind of impressions do you have?
I'm impressed by the symmetry, and just the overall like beauty.
Yeah, there is something. It does not feel haphazard at all. It feels very controlled. It feels like this artist knew exactly what they were doing and did exactly what they intended. There is a certain amount of restful symmetry that I agree, Joy. I find it really beautiful. I think it's astounding.
I also think too, like when you're looking at just the beauty of nature, looking at the beauty of a tree or a flower, it's like usually imperfect. And yeah, I don't know. It's like not something we like demand. We don't demand that sort of perfection out of most of the other beauty we encounter.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because perfection today, people that work in the arts, we all have this OCD drive that keeps us awake at night because of the specter of quote unquote perfection. And we assume our understanding of perfection today is, it has to be made by nanites in like a Japanese factory 3,000 years in the future. I mean, that's what perfection is. But the word perfect actually means complete. It's a synonym for complete. And so when we think of that, then suddenly we realize nature is perfect, when it's done. And you're never going to see the same fish scale on the same fish. Everything is going to be slightly different. And I love that kind of perspective, where it feels to me that these artists knew exactly what they were doing, but they didn't have that same kind of mental illness, neurotic compulsion that we have today to make it look like, Japanese robots built it with nanites 3,000 years in the future. That's great when you're making movies, but when you're a human being and you're trying to express your humanity in your art, it doesn't have a place. And I love stuff like this. When we look at this, we see the proportions again. Heads are slightly larger, but we know that that's on purpose because all the bodies are the same. The proportions for the heads are identical, and they're all wearing a specific style of hair. And I think that is probably more reflective of their position and status, or maybe even their role in the social hierarchy. I think that these are most likely going to be probably like a soldier and an interpreter, maybe. I don't know, or a soldier and a servant, a bodyguard and a servant, maybe, because this is an audience hall entry. And I think stuff like this is just really astounding. So these are dated outside of the parameters of our class, but any of these images that I'm showing you in these videos, or that you see in the videos, if I take off any points, just remind me that they're from the videos, or just say from the videos and don't mention the time period, because there is a significant overlap. And I really, since we still have that 300-year window, we're not really sure about the age. It wouldn't surprise me if some of these were older. Like I would be willing to bet that this is a little bit more recent and this feels older. And I think it's really interesting that what's fascinating to me about these plaques is that maybe you can't identify the specific individual, but you know what their role is and what they're doing, what they're holding, you know what kind of clothing they're wearing, and they become more symbols of like a butler or a soldier or a guard or a prince. You know, they become like chess pieces in that respect. I just think it's really fascinating. But there is a very specific visual language to the stuff that we're seeing from Benin that is different from the knock. For one thing, the chin is a lot more rounded. Right here, of course, this is a collar right there. This person is wearing earpieces, and here's a neck piece right there. But even then, the chins are a lot more soft than we saw with the knock, where the chins are almost sharp. And the eyes, even though they're big, the eyes they have this bow on top, where for the knock most of the time the eyes were straight across there, and the noses are more naturalistic for the Benins than the knock. They were quite a bit more stylized. Okay, this is weird. I don't know why. Oh, I see what's going on. Okay. I'm sorry. I got things confused on my own computer. Now, these are the guys that I think are absolutely astounding. This next group, the Ife. The Ife guys are pretty amazing people, and I think that Cubism would have looked a lot differently if Picasso had, in the ethnography museum, had seen Ife work rather than the Igbo and Nok. But I want to share this with you. Now, we saw at the very beginning a bronze head, and now here we see terracotta heads. And again, terracotta is another word for clay. We use terracotta to impress everybody with our education. These are clay heads, and this is one of the reasons why it's assumed that there are royal servants. But what's fascinating to me is you can still see that same kind of level of intense realism that we saw in the bronze at the opening of the class. You know, if you saw this person walking down the street, you would probably recognize them, even if they didn't have the scarring. Originally, it was thought that this was a stylistic choice on the skin, but still today, there are groups in this area, and this is a good place where you can see where the Ife are. There are still groups that take their connection to their past very seriously and still practice scarification. And you know, think about this for just a second. These are vertical scars that go from the hairline all the way down to the lips and then follow the chin and go back up. One thing, there's something that I think that a lot of people completely miss about this. It will take at least 2 weeks for a cut that is deep enough to leave a scar to heal to the point where it's scabbed over and you don't feel like you want to scratch it all the time anymore. I mean, you're still going to feel like that, but it's not unbearable. And these guys, look how straight and even these lines are. this is why this kind of scarification you see in on princes and princesses, kings and queens, emperors, empresses, and the royal servants, because these guys have self-control. I just think that that's amazing. Can you imagine how badly you would want to scratch your face? I mean, that blows me away. Yeah, Aubrey, that face you just made is exactly how I feel. It's amazing to me. It is astounding. And this, I think, is one of the most beautiful examples of bronze in the history of anywhere. This was made while our ancestors were still winding up the Crusades. And it could even be older than that. It may very well be older than that. But this is one of the dates. I have seen examples of this level of workmanship that has been dated back much older than that. But on this is a ruler. He's a king, and look at how tight those lines are. I think whether or not his scarring was actually like that, to that intensity, I don't know. But in a culture where scarification is practiced as a permanent beauty enhancer, what does that kind of tell you about the character of this individual?
High status.
High status, and you're not going to be able to intimidate him. I mean, this guy really has it all together. Now, what do you think, with this being as realistic as it is? Look at those ears. It is really rare for people who stylize their sculpture to make the ears look naturalistic. And having these ears look like actual real ears, that's hard for normal people to do, let alone somebody casting it into bronze. So what do you think? What is your supposition about what these holes could be? If everything is relative, if everything is naturalistic and realistically rendered, why would they have holes right through here? What's your extrapolation? What's your guess?
Did they have something like piercings there, or something that would kind of leave them with like a gauge?
I think that's a really good assumption. I like that. And that there's nothing that survives because, again, this is 1,000 years old. But looking at this, and with, having a mustache and beard myself, the first thing that came to my mind is maybe there's hair that's tied into that. That's what the holes are. Aubrey, I like your idea of the jewelry and stuff like that. And the only reason why I think that this is hair instead is because this kind of mustache and beard style is still popular in a lot of the areas in Nigeria. Now, if you are in a culture where metal is in short supply, and the most valuable piece of metal you're going to have is your sword, essentially, what does shaving represent? If somebody is shaving, what kinds of things could that allude to? The first thing I'm thinking of is if you have metal that is sharp enough or stable enough to keep an edge that you could actually shave with, and you have the capacity to keep that sharp enough that you can shave regularly enough that everybody knows you by your facial hair, that says an awful lot about your status, your relative wealth in the society, because you have the capacity, you own metal that is this that can keep an edge on it. And I think it also says that you have enough free time that you can keep yourself looking good like this. You are demonstrating that things in your sphere of influence are under control enough that you can either take the time to sharpen a blade and shave yourself, or you have the wealth and resources to support somebody to sharpen your blades and shave you. And that you command enough respect that nobody's going to risk hurting you while they shave you. So a lot can be communicated just with the fact that somebody's having facial hair. I think that's pretty cool. This is absolutely beautiful. And one of the videos that I have a link to is where they work through the process of how some of these are made. And I think that's really valuable to look at. And then this is one of the terracotta heads. So the article that we just looked at, the time frame that they had was 1100 to 1500, and that's what I put here. But what's interesting is that I've read other articles that push this back quite a bit older, and even other articles that push it forward quite a bit more recently. And I would have a tendency to believe that most likely the evidence that survive speaks to a much more long-running tradition of artwork than just that little window. But I think these are. But before we go on, I just want to mention something else, that the faces that you see, these people feel very confident. They feel very calm. They feel very in control. It feels to me that this culture values rest, not rest like taking it easy, but being at rest, like ideas like calmness and meditation, thinking things through. And there is the proportions that the faces are shown in from all the cultures that we looked at. It feels to me these have a closer tie into that same kind of thinking that informed the classical Greek work that was an expression of divinity than a lot of the other cultures we've looked at. There's a lot of reference to the golden ratio and how these features are laid out. And I just think it's astounding. So it wouldn't surprise me if there had been communication between, for example, this group and Greece, but there's nothing that anybody's pointed at that I've read about that demonstrates that conclusively. I think it's really amazing though. So these two videos are really good to watch. They talk about the history of some of these bronze heads, where they come from, and talk about how they were made. There is quite a collection. And what's fascinating to me is a lot of these heads, again, if you saw this person walking around, you would know who they were. You'd recognize them. And that leads us to our reflection. So these cultures, we talked about a lot of different groups of people. And I think that what I basically wanted to do is just introduce you to a non-Egyptian section of Africa that didn't feel quote unquote primitive, do you know what I mean? We have this assumption that people that don't have cell phones and drive cars were somehow primitive. And we have, and a lot of that is supported by the kind of stuff that was shown in the ethnography museums that Picasso and Braque went to, 120 years ago. And it simply does not fit historical facts. The historical evidence shows that these folks really knew what they were doing. And it's absolutely astonishing, the kind of stuff that survives still, 2,000 years later. Did any of this surprise anybody looking at some of this work? I saw at least 4 different very distinct stylistic changes from the different groups, but they all felt connected. And it's interesting to me that all these people overlapped in some cases, several hundred years, keeping their own stylistic identity, but they all were in an area about the size of France. And I think it's pretty amazing. It'd be kind of interesting to find out what kinds of thoughts drove the choices that were used by the artist to or the stylistic choices that were used by the artist. I think it'd be really interesting to find out about that. I think we can extrapolate some, like, knowing that scarification was and still is a big thing. There are some things we can extrapolate from that. Just like when we were talking about what's the difference between making a pinch pot and using a potter's wheel, what can we extrapolate from that technology? The fact that people are doing lost wax casting in bronze, what does that say about the culture and the culture security? We're talking about, I'm sorry, what was that, Joey?
I was going to say it's pretty time intensive. I can't imagine how much effort they're putting into these, and they're doing that instead of surviving. So,
yeah, there's several steps to the process. You have to find a source for wax, for example. You have to figure out that you can melt the wax out and replace it with something else that lasts longer. So that whole set of cognitive decision-making skills has to come into play. You're talking about refining metals, finding different mixes of metals that will work and last a long time without rusting easily. You're talking about a material that you're going to have to surround the wax with that will withstand the rigors of firing, but still be soft enough that you can break it off of the metal that you're casting into it. And that's a whole set of cognitive choices that is astounding to me. So the cultures that have developed bronze casting, particularly lost wax casting, all around the world, I salute you. I think that's absolutely amazing that you've figured that out for everybody that has. But I also wanted to share that the rather underhanded and horrifically manipulative marketing that goes into training us all to believe that Africa is full of starving, skinny children who cry all the time is just completely not true. And the artwork that we see coming from, and this is just one area. If we could spend a whole class just looking at the millions of years old architecture in South Africa, or the stonework in Zimbabwe, or in areas further north. People developed hot and cold running water with clay pipes and wood pipes that would heat and cool palaces, 1,000 years before Europeans put their foot on the shore. And we don't really think about this stuff because of staying up late and watching the garbage on TV, which is kind of sad. But and there's actually a couple really cool TV shows, sci-fi TV shows that come out of South Africa, if anybody's interested, about just some cool sci-fi there, and some other really interesting things that are influencing us today. I would suggest, if you guys are interested in what's going on today, there are two guys that I'd really suggest that you look up. And one is Yinke Shonibara. He lives in, I believe it's Nigeria and London. He goes back and forth between the two places. He's absolutely brilliant. He's a contemporary artist. Well, there's three artists that I'm going to reference. I think he's absolutely astounding. He does a lot of tableaus that are based on the King Louis in France during the 1700s. Several of the King Louis, and but he references contemporary fabric culture in several different countries in Africa as well. He's really cool. But what he does it in such a way that everybody can get it. All of us can appreciate what's going on. Victor Ekpak is another guy that I really love. Joy, what's the name of the New York artist that's on all the subways that he died when he was really young, but he did stick figures, really active stick figures? Keith Haring. Okay, thank you. Victor Ekpak is kind of like the if Keith Harrington is from North America, Victor Ekpak is from Africa. He does that kind of stuff, but he references the oldest written language on the continent, and in a lot of his work does really very cool Keith Haring style graphical textural studies and presentations, beautiful sculptural work. And then another guy that I think is really amazing is a guy named El Anatsui, who he looks like everybody's favorite grandpa. And I believe he's from Ghana. What he does is he takes garbage like beer cans and milk bottle lids, and he puts them together in these tapestries that are 4 stories tall. And so he's using metal and garbage that other people threw away and stomped on, and he's turning them into these astonishingly transcendently beautiful draperies. It's just amazing. So check those guys out if you're looking for contemporary stuff. But for the purposes of reflection, please try to keep it to referencing the stuff that we looked at directly. And please make sure as many of those videos as you can. I try to keep them all under 2 or 3 minutes. Watch them, check out the articles, and I'll give you a little bit more background history. Any last questions before we break for another week and before you guys go off and have fun during fall break? Which for let's be honest, all of you guys are like me. We're going to be cleaning the house, and that's pretty much it. Any last thoughts or observations? Anything that surprised you from any of the stuff that we saw?
I'd seen the Ife heads before, but I was pretty astonished the first time I came across them. But I think as a photographer, I think what stands out for me is that a good portrait is always more than just what a person looks like. And those heads all have so much personality. Like you get a sense of not only what they look like, but what they are like. And I think it's really strange to look at them because you feel like you're looking at people.
Yeah, and I really like that. And my response is to the heads, regardless, is you want to respect them. Whoever that person is, they are a focus for respect. And I think that's pretty amazing. Or at least that's the feeling I get. Any other last observations? Thank you, Joey. All right, then we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining me this week. And next week we will cover some other stuff that in any other context would be mind-numbingly boring, but in the context of this class is going to be super exciting. We're going to talk a little bit more about medieval Europe, particularly in between the Carolingian Renaissance and the Crusades. So maybe 8th century to 11th century. So we are kind of hopping around. Yoruba, this stuff, a lot of it kind of transected the similar time period, but in the continent of Africa. And now we're going back to the continent of Europe. All right, guys, have a good weekend, good week. Enjoy your fall break. And I will look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a good break.
You too.